There are moments in geopolitics when a nation no longer has the luxury of hesitation, when allies begin to speak of security needs instead of respect for sovereignty, when old agreements are cast aside with a single statement. The question is no longer who is right or wrong, but who is capable of defending themselves. Canada is stepping into just such a moment in the Arctic, quietly, without bluster or bold declarations. Each decision, each project, every dollar spent tells the same story. Canada has chosen the path of autonomy, even if that means no longer relying on the United States. If you're someone who values deep geopolitical analysis, where power is revealed through actions, not words, make sure to subscribe and follow along. And now let's begin the story of how Canada is quietly building its own Arctic defense. For a very long time, the Arctic existed in the world's imagination as a harmless void. White ice, cold winds, sparse communities, and a few maps hanging in geography departments. It felt so distant, so detached from the usual struggles for power in the Middle East, the South China Sea, or Europe. But the 21st century has quietly erased that innocence. As the ice melts season by season, as the first ships begin carving paths through once frozen straits, the Arctic has stepped out of the shadows and into the center of global geopolitics. For Canada, this shift is not theoretical. It is something deeply real, deeply tangible. This is a country with the longest coastline in the world, a vast Arctic territory larger than most people can fathom. Yet for decades, it was defended mainly by law, historical precedent, and trust in allies. That trust used to be enough. But trust can't stop ships. Trust can't track new maritime routes. And trust, in a world of fierce competition, is no longer a tool for protecting sovereignty. The Northwest Passage is the clearest symbol of that shift. Once a vague concept in maritime history books, it is fast becoming a route of immense economic, military, and strategic value. To Canada, it is an internal waterway, tightly tied to national sovereignty. But to global maritime powers, it's a shorter, cheaper, and more efficient corridor between oceans. When the stakes are high enough, interpretations of law begin to shift. What makes this story bitter is that the greatest pressure isn't coming from the usual suspects. It's not from Russia with its nuclear icebreaker fleets, nor yet from China with its long-term ambitions. It's from the very neighbor Canada has shared a peaceful border with for over a century. The ally Ottawa once believed would always respect the delicate boundary between cooperation and sovereignty. In that moment, the Arctic is no longer a story of ice and snow. It becomes a story of strategic maturity. Canada is being forced to face an uncomfortable truth. In the new world, sovereignty doesn't exist just because you declare it. Sovereignty only matters if you can enforce it, monitor it, and defend it, even when the pressure comes from the relationships you once believed were safest. And it's from this realization that a quiet but resolute shift has begun to take shape in Ottawa's thinking. Not a pushback through words, not hardline diplomatic statements, but something deeper. A change in how Canada sees its own role in the Arctic. This shift didn't appear in a speech. It was triggered by cold signals from Washington, signals that America's strategy is entering a new phase, one where all illusions of unconditional cooperation are beginning to crumble. The geopolitical jolt that truly woke Canada didn't arrive with gunfire, nor did it require an open declaration of hostility. It came quietly through strategic documents, cold, carefully worded language out of Washington, yet powerful enough to shake every assumption Ottawa once believed to be unshakable. When the United States unveiled its new security strategy, the core message was crystal clear. North America was no longer a shared space built on trust. It was now a domain that must be tightly controlled in the name of America's vital interests. In that view, the Arctic was no longer some remote periphery. It became part of the Northern Defense Line, tied directly to nuclear deterrence, to early warning systems, to the protection of the American mainland against worst-case scenarios. And when a space is labeled vital, all previous legal compromises become secondary. Laws still exist, but only to the extent that they don't obstruct strategic goals. For Canada, the shock wasn't that the US cared about the Arctic. That had long been clear. The shock was that Washington had begun to view shipping lanes through Canada's Arctic archipelago as corridors it should access unconditionally. This perspective, though not always stated outright, had become increasingly evident in U.S. officials' remarks, in defense documents, and in how past agreements were being reevaluated. The 1988 agreement, once seen as a symbol of mutual respect, suddenly felt fragile. When security interests are paramount, a promise to ask for permission becomes inconvenient. For Ottawa, this was the moment when all illusions fell apart. Not because America had betrayed Canada, but because America was acting exactly as a superpower would, driven by the logic of power. This concern quickly spread from Canadian policymakers to the public. Greenland's sudden appearance in U.S. strategic discussions, the rhetoric framing Arctic control as an inherent right, it all stirred deep unease. If even an ally can speak of its partner's territory in that tone, then where does the real safety boundary lie? Prime Minister Mark Carney understood that Canada could not and need not confront the United States directly. But he also understood something just as important. In today's world, absolute dependence equals strategic risk. When all detection, surveillance, and response capabilities are tied to U.S. technology and political will, Canada remains reactive, even within its own existential space. This geopolitical wake-up call didn't spark a sudden outburst. Instead, it set off a deep process of reevaluation. Ottawa began asking questions it had long avoided. What happens if American and Canadian interests no longer align perfectly? What should Canada do if asserting sovereignty clashes with what Washington deems a security threat? And most importantly, does Canada truly own its Arctic, or is it merely managing it on trust? From these questions, a shift in thinking began to take form. Canada realized it could no longer rely on laws and goodwill as its only lifelines. In an increasingly crowded and competitive space, sovereignty had to be anchored in real presence, in capabilities that are visible, tangible, and impossible to ignore. And from that moment on, Canada entered a new phase in its strategic history, no longer defined by passive defense or reliance on a default security umbrella. In its place emerged a simple yet powerful realization: only when you're there, watching, operating, and maintaining control day by day, does sovereignty truly exist. That realization paved the way for a new doctrine, where presence is no longer a choice, it is a condition for national survival. For decades, Canada lived with an almost unconditional belief that the Arctic belonged to it, not through power, but through history, international law, and its standing as a peaceful nation within the Western Order. It was a comforting perspective, fitting for a world where conflict seemed to be contained by treaties and commitments. But as that order began to fracture, the belief revealed a fatal flaw. It did not produce the capability to defend. Canada's shift in thinking didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of quiet observation as small fragments slowly came together to form an unsettling picture. Foreign research vessels began appearing more frequently. Military activity in the Arctic was increasingly mentioned openly in the defense doctrines of major powers. And most importantly, debates over sovereignty were drifting away from the realm of law, edging ever closer to the question of who could exercise actual control. In that context, a new understanding began to take root in Ottawa's strategic thinking. Sovereignty is not a static legal status. It's a continuous process. If you are not present, not monitoring, not responding, your grip on control will erode bit by bit until it exists only on paper. The Arctic, with its extreme distances and unforgiving natural conditions, exposed this truth in the starkest way. What's remarkable is that this shift didn't spark public backlash in Canadian society. On the contrary, it created a rare moment of consensus. Citizens in the South, thousands of kilometers away from the Arctic, began to see a direct connection between that distant frozen region and their own security, economy, and even national identity. The Arctic was no longer an abstract concept. It had become part of Canada's existential story in the New World. From there, an unofficial yet powerful doctrine emerged: presence is sovereignty. No grand slogans, no confrontational declarations. This doctrine boiled everything down to a single, clear principle. If you are there consistently, if you track every movement, if you have the ability to respond independently, then no one can treat that space as empty or up for grabs. This doctrine also marked a critical psychological turning point. Canada no longer viewed itself as a nation being protected within the North American security structure, but as a sovereign actor responsible for its own survival space. That doesn't mean seeing allies as adversaries, but it does mean rejecting the default posture of dependence. Autonomy becomes a necessity, not a short-term political choice, but a strategic imperative. Still, even the most logical doctrine means nothing without real capability behind it. Presence cannot consist of symbolic visits or a few scattered outposts on the map. Presence demands the ability to see, predict, and control a space in real time. And when that question was asked head-on, Canada realized that the starting point wasn't warships or troops. It was something far more fundamental to modern power: awareness. Because if you don't know what's entering your space, if you're only alerted when someone else has already seen it, then your presence is merely performative. It was from that need that Canada began building its own eyes in the Arctic, a system capable of seeing beyond the horizon, independently and without blind spots, laying the foundation for the next step in its strategy to assert sovereignty. The Arctic is so vast that it defies human comprehension when viewed only on a map. Its sweeping expanses of ice, sea, and sky render all traditional notions of defense outdated. Here, borders don't appear as fences or markers, but in faint signals, distant movements, sometimes nothing more than a tiny flicker of interference across a sea of white. That's why, when Canada decided to make presence the foundation of its sovereignty, the first step wasn't to show force. It was to reclaim the right to see. For many years, Canada's situational awareness in the Arctic was tied to shared North American early warning systems, with the U.S. playing the central role in technology and data. This model worked well when trust remained intact, but as strategic interests began to diverge, that dependence turned into a dangerous vulnerability. You cannot assert sovereignty if every early warning comes from someone else. You certainly can't act with autonomy if what you see is filtered through another power's priorities. Over-the-horizon radar emerged as Canada's answer to this dilemma. Not a single piece of equipment, but a completely different way of perceiving space. Rather than waiting for threats to come near, this technology bends radar waves through the ionosphere, allowing detection of objects thousands of kilometers away, far beyond traditional line-of-sight limits. In the Arctic, where reaction time can mean the difference between control and compromise, the ability to see early is power. What's most notable isn't just the system's range, but how Canada chose to build it. The radar stations are located deep within Canadian territory, operated by Canadian personnel, and integrated into a command chain answerable solely to Ottawa. The data is processed first and foremost for national needs, not as a default contribution to any external network. It's a quiet declaration, but a bold one. Canada intends to know what's happening in its own space before anyone else does. This shift brought about a profound psychological effect. For the first time, Ottawa was no longer in a position of waiting to be told. It became the actor shaping the northern security picture. The Arctic, once seen as an uncontrollable frontier, gradually transformed into a space of continuous surveillance, where every movement left a trace. Sovereignty then ceased to be abstract. It became linked to data, foresight, and the ability to make decisions at the right moment. But radar, no matter how advanced, is still just a pair of eyes. It can see, but it can't reach. It can warn, but it can't be there. And in geopolitics, merely observing without a tangible deterrent carries inherent risks. When you detect a threatening move, the inevitable next question is, what will you do about it? It was at this point that Canadian strategists confronted a crucial limitation. Spatial awareness is necessary, but never sufficient. To truly be present in the Arctic, Canada needed a capability that could endure the harsh environment, move silently beneath thick layers of ice, and translate radar data into concrete strategic weight. A capability that didn't need to appear often, but when it did, could not be ignored. And so, Canada's defense thinking began shifting from the skies and radio waves to beneath the cold Arctic waters. There, in the silent depths of the Arctic Ocean, power isn't measured by visibility, but by silence. And it was in that silence that Canada found the next piece of its presence is sovereignty doctrine, a card played without noise, yet powerful enough to reshape how the world perceives Ottawa's grip on its existential space. If over-the-horizon radar is Canada's eyes, allowing it to see the Arctic from afar, then submarines are its silent presence, making every movement within that space think twice. In a world of ice, frigid water, and perpetual darkness, power doesn't belong to whoever appears the most. It belongs to whoever can stay the longest without being seen. And Canada understands this well, placing its submarine program at the center of its Arctic strategy. For years, Canada's Navy was seen as mismatched with the length of its coastline and the scope of its national responsibility. Modern surface vessels still carry symbolic value, but in the Arctic, symbolism isn't enough. The frozen conditions, vast distances, and unforgiving environment severely limit surface operations. Only beneath the sea, where the ice becomes a natural shield, does presence take on real strategic meaning. The decision to invest in a new submarine fleet, then, is not just a matter of weapons procurement. It's a statement about how Canada intends to exist in the Arctic. The requirements laid out for this program make that thinking clear. The submarines must be able to operate for extended periods under ice, have enough range to cover the entire Arctic archipelago, be quiet enough to avoid detection, and most importantly, be fully independent of any foreign logistical chain or command system. Here, independence is not a preference, it's existential. A submarine is only a true instrument of sovereignty if it can be deployed solely on national terms. If every patrol requires external technical support, shared data, or permission, then the presence it provides will always be conditional. Canada does not want a conditional force. It wants a fleet that can appear in the Northwest Passage, in Arctic Straits, or in sensitive waters, without asking, without explaining, without announcing. The power of a submarine lies not in what it fires, but in the fact that no one is ever sure where it is. The mere ability to persist under the ice is enough to alter the calculus of major powers. A shipping route watched by invisible vessels is no longer open water. It becomes a claimed space, where every action must be weighed against possible consequences. This is what gives Canada's submarine program deterrence power far beyond its actual scale. No overwhelming numbers, no loud presence. Just the certainty that Canada can be there at any moment is enough to disrupt assumptions about free access. The Northwest Passage, under this logic, is no longer a legal debate without end. It becomes a strategic reality, backed by capability. However, submarines also expose another truth. They cannot operate in a vacuum. For a subsurface force to function effectively, it needs an entire ecosystem above and behind it. Bases, deepwater ports, maintenance facilities, supply depots, airstrips, communications, and command networks all must be built in sync. A submarine may stay silent beneath the ice for weeks, but to return, resupply, repair, and redeploy, it needs infrastructure that is both strong and enduring. And it's here that Canada's submarine program reveals its broader role. It has become the driving force behind a wave of infrastructure investment in the Arctic on a scale never seen before. Every upgraded port, every lengthened runway, every new support station is another piece of a long-term power projection puzzle. And unlike political rhetoric, infrastructure can't be undone with a change in government. When a nation pours massive resources into fixed installations at the edge of its territory, it is binding itself to a long-term strategic choice. Future leaders, no matter how dovish or hawkish, won't be able to walk away from a system embedded into the very structure of national security. The Arctic, once a distant frontier, becomes an inseparable part of Canada's strategic life. And it is here that the story moves beyond submarines. Those quiet vessels beneath the sea are only the most visible part of a deeper transformation, where infrastructure itself becomes destiny. As runways, ports, bases, and logistics networks take root in the frozen north, Canada is not just defending its present, it is locking its future onto a path with no turning back. A path of continuous presence and sovereignty asserted every single day. In the Arctic, infrastructure isn't just concrete, steel, and line items in a budget. It is the indelible footprint of power. Once laid upon the ice, it stays, long after governments change, long after public opinion shifts, long after the fleeting cycles of politics pass. Canada understands this better than anyone as it begins turning its Arctic defense plans into concrete, visible, and irreversible structures. Every runway extended by a few hundred meters in the north isn't just for aircraft. It opens the door to year-round resupply, rapid response in emergencies, and the ability to sustain human presence in places once deemed too remote to manage. Every deep water port built isn't just for military vessels, but becomes a new logistical spine for trade, research, and long-term development. Infrastructure, in Canada's logic, is how security is bound to growth and how sovereignty becomes part of daily life. The key lies in how these projects are conceived. They're not designed as stopgap measures. They're built with decades, even generations, in mind. When a logistical base rises in the heart of permafrost, it's not meant to serve a single term or a passing doctrine. It becomes part of the national architecture, forcing every future decision to account for its existence. The Arctic, once a distant edge, is slowly being drawn into the core of Canada's strategic thinking. That's why infrastructure carries more binding power than any political statement. A government can change its tone, but it's far harder to justify abandoning roads, ports, runways, and support facilities that cost tens of billions of dollars and are directly tied to national security. Once infrastructure is in place, strategic choices narrow. In this way, Canada is locking itself into a single path, one of long-term presence with no option to withdraw. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its quiet finality. Canada doesn't need to make bold declarations. It only needs to build, operate, and endure. Over time, this presence becomes self-evident, so ingrained that all stakeholders must accept it as fact. The Arctic ceases to be a space for abstract debate. It becomes an organized, managed, and integrated part of the national rhythm. On a deeper level, infrastructure generates a profound psychological shift. When Canadians see major investments pouring into the North, when local communities are better connected, when military, scientists, and businesses converge, the Arctic stops feeling like someone else's land. It becomes a living part of Canada's national story. Sovereignty, then, is no longer a theoretical concept from textbooks, but something experienced through work, livelihood, and security. And it's here that the meaning of Canada's strategy begins to transcend its borders. A middle power not seeking to challenge a superpower head-on is nonetheless shaping its strategic space through infrastructure, through persistence, and through long-term choices. It's a message that's hard to ignore in a world where many nations feel caught between the gravitational pull of great powers. By proving that investment in infrastructure can be a more effective tool of sovereignty than confrontational rhetoric, Canada has unintentionally created a new model. A model where strength doesn't come from posturing, but from steady construction and refusal to retreat. And from this model, global ripples begin to appear, as other middle powers look to Canada's Arctic and quietly wonder, could this be the path forward for us too, in a shifting world order? From the outside, Canada's Arctic strategy might appear to be a uniquely Canadian story, one of ice, submarines, and distant shipping routes. But if you pause and look deeper, what's unfolding isn't just the adjustment of a single nation. It's the emergence of a new template for how middle powers can define themselves in a fractured world order. Canada isn't challenging anyone with declarations, nor is it crafting confrontational rhetoric. But it is quietly posing a question that many other nations are beginning to consider. Is dependence still a safe choice? For decades, middle powers have grown used to sheltering under the security umbrella of larger powers. That model provided relative stability, but also created a kind of dependency that's hard to escape. As long as interests aligned, everything seemed sustainable. But once strategic priorities begin to shift, that dependency can instantly become a vulnerability. Through its pragmatic actions in the Arctic, Canada has exposed a truth many nations still try to avoid. You only truly have choices when you possess autonomy. What makes Canada's model so compelling isn't military scale, but how it weaves seemingly disparate elements into a coherent whole. Independent spatial awareness, silent presence, and infrastructure with long-term binding power. This isn't a path of confrontation, it's a path of disentanglement. Disentanglement from passivity, from waiting for permission, from the anxiety that comes when an ally's priorities may suddenly turn. This message resonates powerfully in a world where more and more countries feel pressured to pick sides. Canada presents a third option, not standing against, but not standing behind either. It cooperates, but from a foundation of its own capacity. It shares but never relinquishes the final say. For many middle powers, from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, this is a strategic suggestion far more persuasive than any speech. More importantly, this model reframes the very nature of power in the 21st century. Power no longer lies solely in how many weapons you have or how large your defense budget is. It lies in your ability to create structural facts on the ground. If you build a system that forces others to adapt to it, you've gained leverage without ever raising your voice. Through quiet, consistent investment in the Arctic, Canada is doing just that. From this perspective, the global ripple effects of Canada's strategy are not about sparking a new arms race, but about shifting how nations think. Middle powers are beginning to realize that autonomy doesn't have to mean isolation, and independence doesn't have to mean confrontation. It's about developing enough capacity to say yes or no on your own terms. And as more nations begin to ask that question, the machinery of global power will no longer run as smoothly as before. Not because conflicts erupt, but because old chains of dependency start to loosen. In that picture, Canada doesn't play the role of a loud leader, but becomes a quiet proof that even in the cold shadows of the Arctic, a middle power can rewrite the terms of its existence among giants. When all the layers of analysis are laid down, when radar, submarines, bases, and infrastructure are no longer separate pieces but form a coherent picture, Canada's Arctic strategy reveals a far deeper meaning. This is not a story about defeating anyone, nor is it about challenging a more powerful state. It is a story about quietly reclaiming the right to self-determination through capability, through time, and through unwavering resolve. Canada hasn't fired a single shot to shift its position in the Arctic. It hasn't relied on provocative declarations or displays of might. Instead, it has built piece by piece, from the ability to see its own space, to silent presence beneath the sea, and finally locking it all in place with irreversible infrastructure. Each step may seem technical, even dry, but together they produce a profoundly political result. The victory here isn't about imposing one's will on others. It's about ensuring no one can impose theirs on you. When Canada can surveil, be present, and respond independently in the Arctic, it gains the most precious asset in modern geopolitics: the ability to say no without triggering a crisis. The ability to choose cooperation, not because there's no other option, but because it aligns with its own interests. Ironically, pressure from Washington became the catalyst for this transformation. When the US sought more control, Canada chose to stand on its own. When America made security an absolute priority, Canada responded by turning sovereignty into real-world capability. The result wasn't a dramatic rupture between allies, but a quiet shift in the balance of power, where Canada stepped out of dependence without ever declaring independence. The Arctic, then, isn't just changing in geographic or strategic terms, it's changing in mindset. It shows that in an increasingly unstable world, victory doesn't always come from conflict. Sometimes it comes from building something sturdy enough that you don't get pulled into someone else's. It's the kind of victory that doesn't show up on maps, but lasts the longest. Canada's story leaves us with an open question. In a global order that's shifting beneath our feet, where is the line between safety and dependency, between cooperation and autonomy? And which path will each nation, large or small, choose to protect its own space for survival? If you have your own thoughts on that question, leave them in the comments below. Your perspective might offer a new way of understanding what's unfolding in the Arctic and far beyond. And if you're interested in more slow, deep, ground-level geopolitical analysis like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next stories shaping the silent game of power in our world.